Billionaire dumps wife for a younger woman. Her transformation leaves him speechless. The soft murmur of an orchestra filled the grand ballroom, a backdrop to glittering chandeliers and the clink of champagne flutes. Alan Kingston, one of the wealthiest men in the city, stood at the center of the room with a younger woman on his arm. She was radiant, her glossy dark hair framing a perfect face, her slim figure wrapped in a gown that seemed to sparkle with every step. Her name was Sophia, and she was everything Alan thought he wanted: young, vibrant, and an undeniable status symbol. His wife, Margaret, wasn't in the room. She was back at their sprawling estate, nursing the remains of their marriage, still reeling from the announcement that had shattered her world. "I'm leaving you," Alan had said just weeks ago, his tone as cold and businesslike as if he were discussing a corporate merger. "It's not working anymore. You've changed, Margaret. You're not the same woman I married." Margaret had stared at him in disbelief, her throat tight with 1,000 unsaid words. She wasn't the same woman? Of course she wasn't. She'd spent the last 20 years raising their children, managing their home, and standing by him through his meteoric rise to wealth and fame. Every wrinkle on her face, every gray hair, was a testament to the sacrifices she had made to support his ambitions. But Alan didn't want sacrifices. He wanted perfection. And now he had found it in Sophia. The weeks that followed were some of the darkest of Margaret's life. The tabloids splashed pictures of Alan and Sophia across their pages, the headlines dripping with mockery. Billionaire's new flame, out with the old, in with the new. Friends she thought she could count on avoided her calls, not wanting to be caught in the middle of a scandal. Even her children, both grown and living abroad, struggled to comfort her from a distance. Margaret spent most of her days in the cavernous emptiness of their mansion, the silence a constant reminder of what she had lost. The lavish decor that once felt like home now seemed cold and lifeless, as though it belonged to a stranger. One evening, as she sat on the edge of her bed staring at the divorce papers, a thought crept into her mind, an unwelcome, nagging voice that asked, "Is this who you want to be? Broken, forgotten, and discarded?" Margaret didn't know the answer. But she did know that she couldn't stay in this place any longer. Not physically, not emotionally. The next morning, Margaret packed a suitcase and left the estate behind. She moved into a modest apartment on the other side of town, away from the prying eyes of high society. It wasn't much, a far cry from the opulence she was used to, but it was hers. For the first time in decades, Margaret had a space that was entirely her own. At first, the days passed slowly. Margaret spent hours walking through the city, finding solace in the anonymity of crowded streets and bustling parks. She kept to herself, unsure of how to rebuild a life that had revolved entirely around someone else's ambitions. But gradually, she began to feel a spark of something she hadn't felt in years: possibility. One day, while browsing a bookstore, Margaret stumbled upon a self-help book titled "Reclaiming Yourself After Heartbreak." The cover was unassuming, the title bordering on cliché, but something about it caught her attention. She bought it on a whim and spent the next few days devouring its pages. The book wasn't a magic solution, but it planted a seed. It encouraged her to set small, achievable goals, to focus on herself for the first time in years. Inspired, Margaret signed up for a fitness class at a nearby studio. She felt ridiculous walking into the brightly lit space, surrounded by women half her age in sleek athletic wear, but the instructor's warm smile put her at ease. The first class was brutal. Margaret's muscles ached, her breath came in short gasps, and she considered quitting more than once. But she didn't. She returned the next day and the day after that. Slowly, her body began to change. The weight she had carried, both physical and emotional, started to lift. Margaret also began exploring hobbies she had long forgotten. She took up painting, a passion she had abandoned after marrying Alan, and joined a local art group. She found joy in the simple act of creating, of letting colors and shapes flow onto a canvas without judgment. The other members of the group welcomed her with open arms, offering friendship without the strings of high society expectations. Meanwhile, Alan's life with Sophia was beginning to show cracks. The initial thrill of their relationship, long nights at exclusive clubs, exotic vacations, and endless shopping sprees, had started to wear off. Sophia's charm, which once seemed effortless, now felt shallow. She complained constantly about wanting more jewelry, more attention, more of everything. Alan, who had always prided himself on his ability to control every aspect of his life, found himself growing increasingly frustrated. It didn't help that his business was struggling. A series of risky investments had backfired, and the media, always eager for a scandal, latched onto his declining fortune. Alan's once unshakable confidence began to waver. For the first time, he started to wonder if he had made a mistake. Months passed, and Margaret's transformation continued. Her once timid demeanor was replaced by a quiet confidence. She carried herself differently now, her posture straighter, her steps purposeful. The pain of her divorce hadn't disappeared, but it no longer defined her. She had found strength in the process of rebuilding, not just her life, but herself. Margaret's new business, a boutique art studio, became a labor of love. She poured her heart into creating a space where people of all ages and skill levels could come together to create. The studio quickly gained a loyal following, and Margaret found herself busier than she had been in years. One evening, as she was locking up the studio, her phone buzzed with a message. It was from an old acquaintance, inviting her to a charity gala. Margaret hesitated. She hadn't attended any social events since the divorce, preferring to stay out of the spotlight. But something about the invitation intrigued her. This wasn't just any gala, it was one of the most exclusive events of the year. And she knew Alan would be there. The night of the gala arrived, and Margaret stood in front of her mirror, taking one last look at herself. Her reflection was almost unrecognizable. She wore a sleek black gown that hugged her figure, her hair styled in soft waves that framed her face. Her makeup was subtle but elegant, accentuating the glow that came from months of self-care and newfound confidence. Margaret smiled, a spark of determination lighting her eyes. She wasn't going to the gala to prove anything to Alan or anyone else. She was going for herself. As she stepped into the grand ballroom, heads turned. Conversations faltered, and a ripple of whispers spread through the crowd. Margaret Kingston, no, just Margaret now, had arrived, and she was radiant. Alan, who was standing near the bar with Sophia, froze when he saw her. His glass hovered midair, his expression a mixture of shock and disbelief. Sophia, oblivious to his reaction, continued chattering about some designer handbag she wanted, but Alan didn't hear a word. His eyes were fixed on Margaret as she glided through the room, her confidence unmistakable. For the first time, Alan felt something he hadn't expected: regret. Margaret moved through the crowd with a grace that seemed effortless, though her heart pounded beneath her composed exterior. She exchanged pleasantries with familiar faces, her voice calm and assured. The same people who once whispered about her divorce now seemed eager to engage with her, their tones tinged with surprise and admiration. She wasn't the same woman they remembered, and that was exactly the point. Alan's eyes never left her. He watched as she greeted acquaintances, her laughter soft but genuine. She carried herself with a confidence that hadn't been there before, a confidence that made him realize just how much he had taken her for granted. Beside him, Sophia prattled on about something inconsequential, her voice a grating buzz in his ear. For the first time, Alan felt embarrassed to be seen with her. Finally, Margaret approached a group of guests standing near Alan. Her eyes swept the crowd, landing on him briefly before moving on. There was no malice in her gaze, no anger, just indifference. And somehow, that stung more than anything else could have. "Margaret," one of the guests said, his tone warm. "It's been ages. You look incredible." "Thank you, Charles," she replied, her smile polite. "It's good to see you again." As the conversation continued, Alan stepped forward, unable to stop himself. "Margaret," he said, his voice low. The group fell silent, their eyes darting between the two. Margaret turned to face him, her expression unreadable. "Alan." For a moment, neither of them spoke. The weight of their history hung in the air, unspoken but palpable. Finally, Alan cleared his throat. "You look amazing." Margaret raised an eyebrow, her smile faint. "Thank you." Sophia, sensing the tension but not understanding it, slid her arm through Alan's. Alan, aren't you going to introduce me? Margaret's gaze flicked to Sophia, her expression neutral. We've met, she said simply. Briefly. Sophia's lips curved into a bright, rehearsed smile. All right, that was ages ago. I don't think we really got the chance to talk. Margaret nodded, her tone cool. No, we didn't. Alan shifted uncomfortably, his usual confidence nowhere to be found. Margaret, can we talk? Just the two of us? Sophia frowned, clearly displeased. Alan, it's fine, Margaret said, cutting her off. She turned to Alan, her expression calm. Let's step outside. The air was crisp as they stepped onto the balcony, the noise of the gala fading behind them. Margaret leaned against the railing, her posture relaxed, while Alan stood awkwardly a few feet away. For a moment, neither of them spoke. You've changed, Alan said finally, his voice hesitant. Margaret tilted her head, her gaze steady. Yes, I have. Alan ran a hand through his hair, his polished facade cracking. I don't even know what to say. I didn't expect to see you here. And I definitely didn't expect. He gestured vaguely as if struggling to find the right words. This? Margaret repeated, her tone dry. You? Alan clarified. You look incredible, Margaret. And you seem happy. I am, she said simply. Alan hesitated, the weight of his regrets pressing down on him. I made a mistake, he admitted, his voice barely above a whisper. Leaving you, it was the worst decision I've ever made. Margaret's lips curved into a faint smile, though there was no warmth in it. Is that so? Yes, Alan said, his tone growing more desperate. I thought I needed something different. Someone different. But seeing you now, I realize how wrong I was. You were always there for me, Margaret. You supported me through everything. And I didn't appreciate it. Margaret studied him for a moment, her expression thoughtful. You're right, she said finally. You didn't appreciate it. You took me for granted, Alan. And when I stopped fitting your image of perfection, you replaced me without a second thought. Alan winced, her words cutting deeper than he cared to admit. I was a fool, he said. But I see that now. I see what I lost. Margaret shook her head, her voice calm but firm. You didn't lose me, Alan. You threw me away. There's a difference. Alan opened his mouth to respond, but no words came. He had no defense, no justification. Everything she said was true. Margaret straightened, her gaze unwavering. I spent years building my life around you, putting your needs and your ambitions above my own. And when you left, I thought I had nothing. But I was wrong. Losing you was the best thing that ever happened to me. Alan's eyes widened, the finality of her words sinking in. Margaret, please. I don't need your apology, she said, cutting him off. And I definitely don't need you back. I've moved on, Alan. You should too. With that, she turned and walked away, her steps confident and unhurried. Alan watched her go, his chest tight with the weight of his regrets. For the first time in his life, he understood what it meant to truly lose something. Inside the ballroom, Margaret rejoined the crowd, her smile brighter than ever. She didn't look back, didn't let Alan's presence dampen her spirits. This night wasn't about him, it was about her. It was about celebrating the person she had become, the life she had built on her own terms. As the evening wore on, Margaret found herself surrounded by new friends and old acquaintances, all eager to reconnect. She spoke with warmth and confidence, her laughter genuine and infectious. For the first time in years, she felt free. Alan left the gala early, unable to shake the image of Margaret's confident stride and unwavering words. The ride home with Sophia was tense, her complaints about the event grating on his nerves. She didn't understand what had happened, didn't understand the depth of his loss. By the time they reached his penthouse, Alan felt more alone than ever. The opulence of his surroundings, once a source of pride, now felt hollow. He sat on the edge of his bed, staring out at the city lights, and wondered if he would ever feel whole again. Months later, Margaret's art studio continued to thrive, her life filled with purpose and joy. She no longer thought about Alan. He was a chapter she had closed, a lesson she had learned. Her days were filled with creativity, connection, and the quiet satisfaction of knowing she had built something beautiful from the ashes of her old life. One afternoon, as she prepared for a new class, a delivery arrived, a bouquet of flowers, accompanied by a note. Margaret frowned as she opened it, her eyes scanning the familiar handwriting. "Margaret, I'm sorry for everything. I hope you find happiness in the life you've created. Alan." She stared at the note for a moment before folding it and placing it in the trash. The flowers, however, she kept. They were beautiful, and she decided they would look lovely in the studio. As Margaret arranged the bouquet in a vase, a smile played on her lips. Alan's apology was too little, too late, but it didn't matter. She didn't need his validation or his regret. She had everything she needed, herself. Margaret set the vase of flowers on a shelf in the studio, their vibrant colors brightening the room. She stepped back and admired her work, a contented smile gracing her face. The note from Alan had barely registered beyond its brief interruption to her day. It was a reminder of the past she had already left behind, a distant memory that held no weight in her present or future. Margaret had long since learned that her happiness wasn't tied to anyone else's approval or apology. Her studio had become a bustling hub of creativity and community. The once modest space was now filled with light, laughter, and the hum of inspiration. Students of all ages gathered here, from retirees rediscovering old passions to young professionals seeking a creative outlet. Margaret had created more than just an art studio. She had built a sanctuary where people could express themselves freely, just as she had learned to do. One of her students, a middle-aged woman named Laura, approached her that afternoon with a canvas in hand. "Margaret, I wanted to show you this," she said, her voice tinged with nervous excitement. "It's my first attempt at something abstract." Margaret took the canvas and studied it carefully. The colors were bold, the brush strokes filled with emotion. "This is wonderful, Laura," she said sincerely. "You've captured so much feeling here." Laura's face lit up. "Really? I wasn't sure if it was any good." "It's not about being good," Margaret said. "It's about expressing yourself. And you've done that beautifully." Laura smiled, her confidence visibly growing. Moments like these were what Margaret lived for now, helping others find their voice, their courage, their joy. It was a far cry from the life she had lived as Alan's wife, where her own needs and dreams had often been overshadowed by his. Meanwhile, Alan's life had taken a turn for the worse. The cracks in his relationship with Sophia had widened into chasms. What had once seemed exciting and glamorous now felt shallow and draining. Sophia's constant demands for attention and material possessions grated on him, and her lack of interest in anything beyond appearances left him feeling empty. His business troubles only compounded his frustrations. A series of failed investments had tarnished his reputation, and the board of directors was growing restless. For the first time in his career, Alan felt the sting of failure, and he didn't know how to handle it. One evening, as he sat alone in his penthouse, nursing a glass of scotch, Alan found himself scrolling through social media. He came across a post from a mutual acquaintance who had attended one of Margaret's recent art exhibits. The photo showed Margaret standing beside one of her paintings, her smile radiant and her posture confident. The caption read, "An incredible evening at Margaret's art studio. She's truly inspiring." Alan stared at the photo, a hollow ache settling in his chest. Margaret looked happy, genuinely happy, in a way he hadn't seen in years. And the success she had built for herself was undeniable. It was a stark contrast to the hollow shell his own life had become. For the first time, Alan allowed himself to admit what he had been avoiding for months. He missed Margaret. He missed her kindness, her strength, her unwavering support. And he hated himself for throwing it all away. A few weeks later, Alan found himself standing outside Margaret's studio, unsure of what he was doing there. He had no plan, no idea what he would say if she saw him. But something had drawn him here, a need to see her, to understand how she had moved on so completely while he was still stuck in the wreckage of his own decisions. Through the large windows, he could see Margaret inside, laughing with a group of students as they worked on their paintings. She looked so at ease, so fulfilled, that it took his breath away. He had always thought of Margaret as someone who existed in his orbit, someone whose life revolved around his. Seeing her like this, independent, thriving, was both humbling and painful. Alan turned to leave, but the sound of the door opening behind him stopped him in his tracks. "Alan?" Margaret's voice was calm but tinged with curiosity. He turned to face her, his hands shoved into his pockets. "Hi, Margaret." She stepped outside, closing the door behind her. "What are you doing here?" Alan hesitated, the words he had rehearsed in his mind suddenly feeling inadequate. "I wanted to see you," he said finally. "I heard about the studio. It's amazing, Margaret. You've done incredible things." Margaret crossed her arms, her expression neutral. "Thank you. But you didn't come all this way just to give me a compliment." Alan winced, her straightforwardness cutting through his pretense. "No, I didn't. I came because I wanted to apologize. For everything." Margaret raised an eyebrow, her gaze steady. "You've already apologized, Alan. And I accepted it. But I've moved on. You should too." "I know," Alan said quickly. "I know you've moved on. I see that. But I can't stop thinking about everything I threw away. You supported me through everything, through my career, my success, my failures, and I didn't appreciate it. I didn't appreciate you." Margaret sighed, her posture relaxing slightly. "Alan, I'm not the person I was when we were married. I'm not that woman anymore." "I know," he said. "And that's what makes this so hard. You've become everything. You're confident, successful, happy. And he paused, running a hand through his hair. "I just wanted to tell you how proud I am of you. Even if I wasn't smart enough to see your worth when I had the chance." Margaret's expression softened, but only slightly. "Thank you for saying that," she said. "But my worth isn't tied to what you or anyone else thinks of me. I know my value now. And I don't need you, or anyone else, to validate it." Alan nodded, her words hitting him with the weight of truth. "I understand. I hope you find happiness, Margaret." "I already have," she said simply. With that, Margaret turned and walked back inside, the door closing softly behind her. Alan stood there for a moment, the quiet street around him amplifying the emptiness he felt. He had come here seeking closure, but all he had found was the confirmation of what he already knew. Margaret had moved on, and he was no longer a part of her story. Back inside the studio, Margaret took a deep breath, letting the conversation with Alan fade from her mind. She had spent too long dwelling on the past, and she wasn't about to let it distract her from the life she had built. Her students greeted her with smiles as she rejoined them, their energy a welcome reminder of why she had started this journey in the first place. As the evening wore on, Margaret felt a deep sense of contentment. Her life wasn't perfect, it was messy and unpredictable at times, but it was hers. She had reclaimed her identity, her happiness, and her future. And that was worth more than anything Alan or their old life together could have ever offered. Margaret's studio bustled with activity as the weeks turned into months. The place had become a sanctuary not only for her but for everyone who walked through its doors. Her students, some loyal regulars, others new faces, brought with them a shared desire for creativity and growth. The studio wasn't just about painting, it was about transformation, expression, and finding joy in the process. Margaret's days were filled with purpose. She ran morning workshops for beginners, hosted evening classes for advanced painters, and spent her weekends curating community art events. Each day brought her closer to realizing her full potential, and the fulfillment she felt was unlike anything she had experienced during her years as Alan's wife. One evening, after wrapping up a particularly lively class, Margaret sat alone in the quiet studio. The hum of the city outside filtered in through the windows, but inside, the air was calm. She stared at a blank canvas, her thoughts drifting to the life she had left behind. She didn't think about Alan often, but when she did, it was with a sense of detachment. The pain of their separation had long since faded, replaced by gratitude for the freedom it had given her. Alan had been a chapter in her life, one that had taught her important lessons, but he wasn't part of the story she was writing now. As she picked up a brush and dipped it into a pool of vibrant blue paint, Margaret let her mind wander. The strokes came naturally, her hand moving with confidence as she brought the canvas to life. It was in moments like these, when the world fell away, that she felt truly at peace. Meanwhile, Alan's life continued its downward spiral. His relationship with Sophia had dissolved, ending in a bitter breakup that played out in the tabloids. She had taken what she could from him, emotionally, financially, and socially, and left him feeling emptier than ever. His business struggles persisted, and his once pristine reputation was now tarnished by whispers of failure. Alan spent most of his days holed up in his penthouse, avoiding the world he had once dominated. He no longer felt like the man he had been, a man who was powerful, successful, and envied by all. Instead, he felt like a shadow of himself, haunted by the choices that had brought him here. One afternoon, as he sat on his balcony nursing a glass of whiskey, Alan's phone buzzed with a notification. It was an email from an old friend inviting him to an art exhibit. Alan almost ignored it, but something about the subject line caught his attention. An evening with Margaret Kingston? He opened the email, scanning the details. Margaret was hosting a solo exhibition, showcasing her artwork and celebrating the success of her studio. The event was set to take place in one of the city's most prestigious galleries, a testament to just how far she had come. Alan stared at the email for a long moment, his thoughts racing. He hadn't seen Margaret since the day he visited her studio. The memory of their conversation still lingered, her words cutting through him like a blade. But as much as he had tried to move on, he couldn't. The thought of her strength, her resilience, her transformation, was a constant presence in his mind. Against his better judgment, Alan decided to attend the exhibit. He told himself it was out of curiosity, a desire to see her success firsthand. But deep down, he knew it was more than that. The night of the exhibit arrived, and Alan found himself standing in front of the grand gallery. The facade was illuminated by warm lights, and through the tall windows, he could see the space inside filled with guests. The air buzzed with excitement, a testament to Margaret's growing influence in the art world. Alan hesitated before stepping inside. He felt out of place, unsure of whether he belonged here. But as he entered, he was greeted by the sight of Margaret's artwork lining the walls, bold, vibrant pieces that seemed to pulse with life. Each painting told a story, capturing emotions and moments that felt both deeply personal and universally relatable. Margaret stood near the center of the room, surrounded by a group of admirers. She wore a sleek emerald green dress that complemented her radiant energy. Her smile was genuine, her laughter ringing out like music. She was in her element, and Alan couldn't help but feel a pang of longing as he watched her. One of the guests noticed Alan and approached him with a smile. "Alan Kingston, isn't it? I didn't expect to see you here." Alan forced a polite smile. "Yes, I'm just here to support Margaret." The guest nodded, their tone turning wistful. "She's come so far, hasn't she? I remember when she first started her studio. To see her like this now, it's inspiring." Alan murmured his agreement, though his chest tightened at the words. He wasn't sure if it was pride or regret, or perhaps a mix of both. Margaret eventually noticed Alan from across the room. Her expression didn't falter, but there was a flicker of surprise in her eyes. Excusing herself from the group she was speaking with, she walked over to him, her movements graceful and composed. "Alan," she said, her tone even. "I didn't expect to see you here." "I almost didn't come," he admitted, "but I wanted to see your work. It's incredible." Margaret studied him for a moment before nodding. "Thank you. I've worked hard to get here." "I can see that," Alan said. "You've built something amazing, Margaret. I hope you know that." "I do," she said simply. There was a pause, the weight of unspoken words hanging between them. Finally, Alan spoke again, his voice quieter. "I'm proud of you." Margaret's expression softened, though her guard didn't drop. "I appreciate that, Alan. But I didn't do this for you, or for anyone else. I did it for me." "I know," he said. "And that's what makes it so incredible." Margaret nodded, her gaze steady. "I'm glad you came, Alan. But I hope you understand that this is my world now. And I'm happy in it." Alan smiled faintly, though the sadness in his eyes was unmistakable. "I'm glad you're happy, Margaret. You deserve it." With that, she excused herself and returned to her guests, leaving Alan standing alone in the gallery. He felt a strange sense of closure as he watched her, as though he had finally let go of the last remnants of their shared past. As the night wore on, Margaret continued to shine, her confidence and warmth drawing people to her. She didn't think about Alan again after their brief conversation. Her focus was on the present, on the people who had supported her and the future she was building. When the exhibit finally ended, Margaret stood alone in the gallery, surveying the space. The walls, once adorned with her artwork, were now bare. But the energy of the night lingered, a reminder of how far she had come. She thought about the woman she used to be, the woman who had devoted herself to someone who didn't value her, who had lost herself in the process. That woman was gone, replaced by someone stronger, someone who knew her worth. Margaret smiled to herself as she turned off the lights and locked the door. Her journey wasn't over, it was only just beginning. Margaret walked back to her apartment that night with a sense of fulfillment. The art exhibit had been a resounding success, and the conversations, laughter, and support from those who attended lingered in her mind like a melody. Her journey of transformation had culminated in this moment, not as a final destination, but as a sign that she was on the right path. When she reached her building, the doorman greeted her warmly, and she returned the gesture with a kind smile. The elevator ride to her floor was quiet, but her thoughts were far from still. Memories of the evening played back, interspersed with the image of Alan standing awkwardly in the gallery. For a brief moment, she felt a twinge of pity for him, but it passed quickly. She had learned to let go of the weight of his choices. Inside her apartment, Margaret placed her keys on the counter and took off her heels, relishing the soft comfort of the floor beneath her feet. The once modest apartment was now a reflection of who she had become, warm, inviting, and filled with personal touches that spoke to her individuality. Art supplies were neatly arranged in one corner, while bookshelves lined the walls, filled with works that had inspired her over the years. She brewed herself a cup of chamomile tea and sat by the window, looking out at the city lights. The world seemed so vast, so full of opportunity. For the first time in years, Margaret felt truly alive. She wasn't the wife of a billionaire anymore, nor the woman who had been left behind. She was Margaret, an artist, a businesswoman, and a woman who had reclaimed her life. Meanwhile, Alan sat alone in his penthouse, the silence almost deafening. The echo of Margaret's voice from the exhibit replayed in his mind. Her strength, her poise, and the effortless way she had captivated the room, he couldn't stop thinking about it. She was a different person now, and while he admired her transformation, it also magnified his own emptiness. His penthouse, once a symbol of his success, now felt cold and lifeless. The luxurious furniture and grand views seemed hollow, reminders of a life built on ambition rather than meaning. Sophia's departure had left a bitter taste, and his business woes continued to haunt him. Alan had once believed that wealth and power were all he needed, but Margaret's resilience had shattered that illusion. Alan stood by the window, his reflection staring back at him. He didn't recognize the man he had become, a man defined by regret. He poured himself another drink, the amber liquid swirling in the glass, and thought about his next move. For so long, he had been running on autopilot, driven by ego and the pursuit of more. But now, he wondered if it was too late to find something real, something meaningful. The weeks that followed were filled with new beginnings for Margaret. Her studio flourished, with classes fully booked and partnerships forming with local organizations. She had started mentoring young artists, finding joy in nurturing their talent and helping them navigate the challenges of creative expression. One of her ments, a teenage girl named Lily, reminded Margaret of herself at that age, eager, curious, and full of potential. Lily often stayed late after class, working on her paintings and seeking advice from Margaret. One evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, painting the sky in hues of orange and pink, Lily approached Margaret with a canvas in hand. "Ms. Margaret, do you think this is good enough for the community art show?" Lily asked, her voice tinged with uncertainty. Margaret took the canvas and examined it closely. The painting depicted a field of wildflowers, the colors vibrant and the brushstrokes deliberate. "It's beautiful, Lily," she said. "But more importantly, it's honest. It reflects who you are, and that's what matters most." Lily beamed, her confidence growing with Margaret's encouragement. "Thank you. I've learned so much from you." Margaret smiled, her heart swelling with pride. "You've taught me too, Lily. Never forget that art is about connection, between you and the world, and between you and yourself. While Margaret's life continued to bloom, Alan struggled to find direction. He attended therapy at the urging of a close friend, hoping to make sense of his emotions and the choices that had led him here. Each session was a challenge, forcing him to confront uncomfortable truths about himself and the way he had treated the people who cared about him. His therapist, a patient but firm woman named Dr. Harper, didn't let him off the hook. "You've spent your life chasing external validation," she said during one session. "But what happens when the applause stops? Who are you without the success and the status?" Alan didn't have an answer, but he knew he wanted to find one. He began volunteering at a local nonprofit that supported small businesses. It was a far cry from the high-stakes world of corporate mergers and acquisitions, but the work felt grounding. He met entrepreneurs who poured their hearts into their ventures, people who valued passion over profit. Their stories humbled him and made him realize how much he had overlooked in his own life. One afternoon, as he helped a single mother secure a loan for her bakery, Alan felt a flicker of something he hadn't felt in years: purpose. It wasn't about him anymore. It was about giving back, about making amends in the only way he knew how. Months later, Margaret received an unexpected letter in the mail. The envelope was plain, the handwriting unfamiliar. She opened it carefully and unfolded the single sheet of paper inside. The letter was from Alan. "Dear Margaret, I hope this letter finds you well. I wanted to thank you, not for what you did for me in the past, but for what you've done for yourself. Seeing you at the exhibit was a wake-up call, a reminder of what strength and resilience look like. You taught me a lesson I should have learned a long time ago, that true success isn't about wealth or power, but about authenticity and connection. I've been working to change, to be someone who values the things that really matter. It's a slow process, but I wanted you to know that you inspired it. I don't expect anything from you, but I hope you'll accept this letter as a small token of my gratitude. Wishing you all the happiness in the world. Sincerely, Alan." Margaret read the letter twice, her emotions a mixture of surprise and reflection. She folded it carefully and placed it in a drawer. The letter didn't change anything, her life was her own now, but it was a reminder of how far she had come. As the seasons changed, so did Margaret's journey. She continued to grow, both personally and professionally, finding joy in the smallest moments and the connections she built with others. Alan, too, found a new sense of purpose, dedicating his time to causes that mattered and learning to let go of the man he used to be. Their paths rarely crossed, but when they did, it was with mutual respect and a shared understanding of the lessons they had learned. Margaret had moved on, stronger and more fulfilled than ever, while Alan had finally begun to understand what it meant to live a life of meaning. And so, their story continued, not as a shared one, but as two separate journeys, each shaped by the past but no longer defined by it. Margaret's days continued to be filled with the hum of activity, her studio now a central part of the community. Classes were fully booked, and her mentorship program with young artists had gained recognition in local media. The success of her work wasn't just in the numbers. It was in the stories of transformation she witnessed every day. One such story was that of Lily, the teenage girl who had become a regular presence at the studio. Margaret watched with pride as Lily's confidence blossomed, her once tentative brushstrokes now bold and full of conviction. The community art show was just around the corner, and Lily had entered 3 of her pieces, each one reflecting her growth. "Ms. Margaret," Lily said one afternoon as they cleaned up after class, "do you ever feel nervous about showing your work?" Margaret smiled at the question, memories of her own early exhibitions flashing through her mind. "Every artist feels nervous, Lily. It's part of the process. But the important thing is to remember why you're doing it. Your art is a reflection of you, and that's something to be proud of." Lily nodded, her expression thoughtful. "I hope I can be as brave as you someday." "You already are," Margaret replied, placing a reassuring hand on her shoulder. While Margaret's life flourished, Alan was slowly rebuilding his own. The volunteering work he had taken on was no longer just a distraction. It had become a source of genuine fulfillment. He found himself inspired by the people he met, their resilience reminding him of the strength Margaret had shown. At the nonprofit, Alan had started mentoring small business owners, using his experience in the corporate world to help them navigate challenges. One woman, a florist named Maria, had been on the verge of closing her shop when Alan stepped in to assist. Together, they restructured her business plan, secured new funding, and found ways to expand her customer base. When Maria's shop celebrated its reopening, Alan attended the small gathering, feeling a sense of pride he hadn't experienced in years. As he watched Maria cut the ribbon and thank her community, he realized that this work, helping others succeed, was far more meaningful than any deal he had closed in the past. But even as Alan found purpose in his work, thoughts of Margaret lingered. He hadn't seen her since the exhibit, but her presence in his mind was constant. He didn't long to rekindle their relationship. He knew that chapter was closed, but he wished he could express how much her strength had influenced his journey. Margaret's own journey was about to take an exciting new turn. She had been approached by a renowned art gallery in New York City, which wanted to host a solo exhibition of her work. The opportunity was a dream come true, and Margaret knew it was a testament to how far she had come. The preparations for the exhibit consumed her days, her studio filled with canvases in various stages of completion. Each painting was deeply personal, capturing moments of joy, pain, and transformation. Margaret poured her heart into the work, knowing this was her chance to share her story on a larger stage. When the day of the exhibition arrived, Margaret stood in the gallery surrounded by her art, her heart swelling with pride. Guests from all walks of life had come to see her work, their admiration evident in the way they lingered before each piece. As Margaret moved through the crowd, she felt a tap on her shoulder. Turning, she was surprised to see Alan standing there, his expression tentative but sincere. "Margaret," he said, his voice quiet. "This is incredible." "Thank you," she replied, her tone polite but measured. "I wasn't expecting to see you here." Alan nodded. "I read about the exhibit in the papers. I wanted to see it for myself." Margaret studied him for a moment, noting the changes in his demeanor. He seemed more grounded, less polished in a way that felt authentic. "I'm glad you came," she said finally. "These paintings represent my journey, everything I've been through, everything I've become." Alan's gaze shifted to the nearest painting, a vibrant piece that seemed to radiate energy. "It's beautiful," he said, "and powerful. Just like you." Margaret smiled faintly. "Thank you." They stood in silence for a moment, the weight of their shared history hanging between them. Finally, Alan spoke again. "I wanted to say, I'm sorry. Not just for how I treated you, but for not seeing you for who you truly are. You deserved better." Margaret nodded, her expression softening. "I've forgiven you, Alan. And I hope you've forgiven yourself." "I'm working on it," he admitted. "But seeing what you've accomplished, it's inspiring. You've shown me what it means to rebuild, to find purpose." Margaret's smile grew warmer. "I'm glad to hear that. We've both come a long way." Alan extended his hand, and Margaret shook it firmly. It was a gesture of closure, a mutual acknowledgement of the past and the paths they had taken since. As Alan left the gallery, Margaret felt a sense of peace. Their chapter was truly closed, and she was ready to move forward without any lingering ties. In the months that followed, Margaret's career continued to soar. Her New York exhibition was met with critical acclaim, and her work was soon featured in galleries across the country. She traveled extensively, sharing her art and her story with audiences who were captivated by her resilience and creativity. Despite her growing success, Margaret remained grounded. She continued to run her studio, mentoring young artists and giving back to the community that had supported her. Her life was a testament to the power of reinvention, proof that it was never too late to start over. One evening, as Margaret stood in her studio gazing at a new canvas, she felt a sense of gratitude wash over her. She thought about the woman she had been, the woman who had defined herself by someone else's expectations, who had doubted her own worth. That woman was gone, replaced by someone stronger, wiser, and infinitely more fulfilled. Margaret picked up her brush and began to paint, the colors flowing onto the canvas like a symphony. She didn't know what the future held, but she knew one thing for certain: she was ready to face it on her own terms.